personal appeal to his U.S. counterpart, Chinese President Xi Jinping said Friday that neither he or President Trump would want to see a fracturing of China-U.S. relations. But what signal is he trying to send? Speaking of tariffs, President Trump claims a victory in the U.S. border dispute with Mexico. But had the Mexicans already agreed to get tougher on migrants? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. On Friday, Chinese President Xi Jinping, in a reference, called U.S. President Donald Trump his friend. He made the remarks at a high-level economic forum in Russia while addressing the potential for a complete rupture between the world's two largest economies. President Trump has in the past also hailed his friendship with President Xi, but his top trade negotiator on Sunday told U.S. media that President Trump will decide whether to slap new tariffs against China after the expected summit between the two leaders later this month in Japan. So how to interpret the signals coming from the two sides? For our discussion, we're joined from the U.S. by Blackburn-Dwyer, president of Grasshopper Strategies, from Philadelphia, and from Washington, D.C., we're joined by Rubin, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and here in the Beijing studio by Professor Huang Jing, Dean of the Institution of International and Regional Studies at Beijing Language and Culture University. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. Let's start right away with the much talked about quote by President Xi, and this is unofficial translation, of course, but let's take a listen to what he said and how he addressed President Trump.
It's really hard to imagine a complete rupture between China and the United States. I wouldn't want to see such a situation, nor would our American friends. I believe that President Trump, who is also a friend of mine, wouldn't want to see it either.
So very rarely have we heard the Chinese president addressing the U.S. president as his friend. Of course, we heard him talk about the Russian president being his best friend, but this is, in our memory, maybe also the very first time that he talked about in public his friendship with the U.S. President Donald Trump. So, Professor Huang, let me go to you first. How unusual really this is, and is there a signal he's trying to send to the U.S. administration?
It is unusual in terms that this is the first time President Xi Jinping openly, publicly said that Donald Trump is his friend, and also publicly said that it is difficult, almost impossible for two countries to decouple. And this is a very good signal, very positive signal, especially in the wake of U.S.-China so-called trade war.
Mm-hmm. Do you think he is trying to tell President Trump or the U.S. administration that he respects President Trump personally, or is there any other signal he might want to send at this particular moment after a couple of weeks of impasse, right, in the trade negotiations? And we are 2 weeks away from the scheduled G20 summit where the two leaders are expected to meet. President Huang, Professor Huang.
I think first, of course, friendship always is a good sign, is a good plus, especially between two topmost leaders of two major powers. I think that signal, as a very positive signal, President Xi Jinping wants to send out is that we, the Chinese, we don't want to fight as friends. We can argue, we can even quarrel, but let's sit down and let's make a deal. Even if we cannot cut a deal right now, let's keep talking. Negotiation is a way to go. And also, he indicated a very fact that interdependence between two economies is such that it is hardly revocable, and it will be mutual damage for sure if both United States and China continue to fight like this. And moreover, it will do substantial damage to the international order without which neither power can do. Mm-hmm. So I think that's a very good signal, especially in the wake of G20.
Mm-hmm. So, Brandon, was that signal well received in the United States?
I think that it's getting a little bit of coverage. Where it really matters is if it's received well inside the Oval Office. And President Trump is different than former U.S. presidents. You know, presidents in the past have been able to separate their own personal approach to politics. President Trump is all personal all the time. When he first met President Xi, he talked openly about how much he respected him, how much he thought they were friends already. When he visited China, he was blown away by the State Visit Plus treatment. And so I think President Xi is very savvy in trying to respond to or on the terms that President Trump would like, which is about talking about friendship. President Trump has often floated the idea that if just President Xi and he got into a room, the two of them could work it out. They're friends. They could make deals. And that's what President Trump values, getting in a room, being the only one that can make the deal. And I think President Xi is responding to that and trying to set the table for that personal connection.
Okay, Joel, how do you look at that? Do you think that this message was received well in the Oval Office?
Well, it's a very clever move by President Xi, and he understands that flattery works with Donald Trump, and that Donald Trump is not a very good negotiator. That, frankly, most of the negotiations that President Trump has engaged in so far have ended up flat or in failure. We don't really have a strategy for engaging China right now on the trade concerns that the United States has had for years. And it's not that President Trump's idea about trade is somehow unique to him. Across the spectrum here in Washington, Democrats and Republicans for years have been concerned about China's trade practices. But what we don't want is a trade war that tanks our economy, and there's a lot of concern about President Trump's ability to steer this into the direction where we actually get a good deal for American consumers. Okay.
Professor Huang, anything to add very briefly in response to what our American colleagues have said?
Yeah, I concur with them that President Trump is quite unpredictable because his ego a little bit too big to be a leader from a major power. But I think there's an old saying in China, the situation dominance, 形势比人强. I think that also remind me of President Bill Clinton's famous line, it's economy stupid. So for the sake of good economy, and I think it's time for both countries to cut a deal, a good deal for both sides.
All right, let's hear the second piece of soundbite from President Xi in the same economic forum where he talked about the problem of globalization and how to address it. Let's listen in.
As the global economy changes, there will always be those who benefit and those who miss out. It's an issue of distribution that some people's interests are harmed. But we can't stop eating for fear of choking. We should solve these problems while continuing to globalize, rather than resorting to protectionism or unilateralism at every turn.
Again, I want to stress that these are unofficial translation here. But Professor Huang, I think we got the gist of the idea. Why do you think it was an important piece of message for President Xi to stress here?
I think that what President Xi Jinping said is quite a common sense or common knowledge. That is globalization.
To the Chinese?
Also to Americans.
Okay.
Globalization actually should benefit all of us. Indeed, in the past 20 or 30 years, globalization has really promoted a global economic development. However, the problem is the distribution. In other words, the economic gap or distribution disparity, income disparity in the United States is enlarged to such extent that Americans do not even stand on the same page on globalization. Not necessarily because they're against globalization, but because only a very handful of people, especially those on Wall Street, benefited from globalization. But the ordinary Americans actually suffer a little bit from it.
Joel, let me go to you. Do you think that is the kind of way to put things that would go down, that would be easily understood by the Americans? How do you see the problem? I mean, we think that the United States benefited from China-U.S. trade, but the problem was that the wealth, the benefit was not distributed evenly, so that you have the hillbillies, you have the staggering wages for the middle classes. How is that problem seen in the U.S.?
Right. Well, President Xi is actually mirroring much of the messaging right now in the Democratic primary, quite frankly, about globalization and about the economy and the distribution of wealth. We do have, as our friend in Beijing said, a deep chasm between the extreme wealthy in this country and basically the rest of the 99% of the population. But that said, the global economy is highly integrated, and trade wars undermine economic growth for everyone, but there need to be rules of the road that are fair and that are equitable, and where, in the big one here in the United States, is where intellectual property is safeguarded. And that's really where there's a lot of concern in that the technology and the development and the ideas generation, which is the future of economic development, that comes out of the United States, that is protected and that's not stolen. And so across the board, you're going to see broad American support for tough positions on intellectual property protection, but you're also not going to see a huge amount of people excited about just complete fair or complete free trade. We do want to see fair trade, excuse me, here. So it is complicated, but the danger in the approach right now of the Trump administration is he's really gone alone.
Yeah.
Getting rid of the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership, as a first step really undermined the president's ability to negotiate a tough deal in this instance, and that's a big concern.
Yeah. Well, President Xi also mentioned that we should solve these problems that were partially caused by globalization while continuing to globalize. So, Brandon, is he trying to say that you can solve the problems of globalization by globalizing further?
I think he is. What's really striking about President Xi is that he is putting forward a line that shows a complete role reversal between the United States' traditional position and China's more recent traditional position, which is that the U.S. for the last 30, 40 years has been saying globalization's the future. We have to break down trade barriers. Even if everybody doesn't benefit equally right away, long term this is going to be great. It's been a very capitalistic type of approach. And China historically had sort of been like, look, we need to do it, but we need to do it in steps. We need to do it with some protections. We need to do it with some barriers, some, middle ground to make sure that we're not being taken advantage of. Now, you have the United States being the one being, oh, we need to protect ourselves, we need tariffs, we need this, that, and the other. And you have China taking over the much more liberalist approach of, hey, globalization will solve all of our problems. Don't worry, it'll all work out in the end. It's a fascinating change of roles that I think China is trying to make sure, at least on a PR point of view, that the world sees them as pro-economic growth, that if this really goes bad, that if there's really no deal after the G20, if there's really another round of tariffs, that President Xi and China is seen clearly by the world as we were all about making this open and access for everybody, but it's the United States that really pulled back from globalization, which has been the trend since the close of the 20th century.
Well, maybe even longer than that. Professor Huang, any comments here? Quick one.
I agree with him, but I have to emphasize on saying that globalization or further globalization has to follow the rule of the game. I think it's a challenge, and the challenge for both sides, United States and China, to really follow the rule of game. And this trade deal, I think, is part of the rule of game making. And in that part, I think both of us, all of us, has to be very serious and be realistic on this.
Yeah. Well, let me talk also about comment. Let's comment on this piece of soundbite that President Xi mentioned, where he talked about the Belt and Road Initiative, and he said, which is also for the first time that we hear it, that he says China doesn't want to be the savior of the world. China doesn't want to be the big boss. So it is not some kind of Marshall Plan that we're trying to push forward. Professor Huang, when you hear the word savior, what does that mean? Is President Xi trying to address some of the concerns directly that have been expressed against this initiative, or something else? Because
there's speculation that China wants to be the boss, wants to be the top dog through the Belt and the Initiative, and that's why Xi Jinping said, we want to be partners of you guys in the development. We don't want to be the savior, not even leader. And in this, he mentioned the Marshall, Plan. We know that Marshall Plan is after World War II. United States have given massive assistance to the Europe called Marshall Plan in order to consolidate U.S. influence or dominance in Europe, especially Western Europe. So that's why some people said China's Belt and Road Initiative is a Marshall Plan, which says that after this, China is seeking a kind of dominance, or at least expansion of China's influence. So that's why President Xi Jinping specifically said this is not China's Marshall Plan, it is just an economic development scheme.
Yeah. Some comments on the interview that U.S. Treasury Secretary Steven Mnuchin gave over the weekend, where he said, told U.S. media that let's take a look at what he said, if China wants to move forward with the deal, we're prepared to move forward on the terms we've done. If China doesn't want to move forward, then President Trump is perfectly happy to move forward with tariffs to rebalance the relationship. So, Jewel, how do you interpret these remarks? Are we likely to see things moving on the right track anytime soon?
Well, I think we could. Again, it's a we have a very ephemeral leader here in the White House, and President Trump doesn't always stick to what he says he's going to do from one day to the next. But I also do want to mention regarding the Marshall Plan, and President Xi's statements about the Belt Road Initiative. The Marshall Plan wasn't done to take control of the West and of Europe. It was done to rebuild Europe after World War II. And the critique of the Belt Road Initiative right now is that China is essentially engaging in transactions with countries where it will have a line for its own economic development purposes. But to me, that reflects there's concern inside China about overextension. And so in both economies, both leaders understand that going too far in their policies, President Trump opposing trade with China, it has blowback, negative consequences like slowing our economic growth. And that may be the key. If our economic growth stalls, he may make a deal.
All right. We have to leave it there. Many thanks to my guests, Blackburn-Dwyer, president of Grasshopper Strategies, Rubin, former U.S. Deputy Assistant Secretary of State, and Professor Huang Jing of Beijing Language and Culture University. You have been watching The Point with me, Li Xing. Coming up after a short break, U.S. President Donald Trump threatened Mexico with tariffs and supposedly got what he wanted with it. Has that become his favorite political tool? Stay with us.